So there are basically three like key things that all sort of relate in getting the right exposure. So first I'll talk about just getting the lighting right, so it's not too dark or too light. So one is aperture, which is basically how wide the lens. So if you have a lens, it's and then you have this thing that changes the aperture. So it's how much light comes through the lens. So it's basically often called the brightness of the lens. And so you usually call it F, say, like on my lens is 1 through F, say 32 or something like that. And basically, if you look at any lens, you'll have an aperture ring like this. And if you look here, you can see that there's like an iris that opens and closes. And basically what you're doing is, this is wide open, so as bright as it can be, and this is as small as it can be. And what you're doing when you're adjusting the aperture basically is changing the amount of light that comes to the lens, right? So that's one piece. The other piece is shutter speed. And that usually, on most cameras you have, say like 1 second through maybe 1/5000th of a second or so. And this is how fast the shutter is opening and closing. And then the third one you have is film speed, or ISO. And this is usually 50 through, say, I don't know,
6400, 3200.
Like 3200 or something like that. And this is basically how much light is required to make the same impression on the film, right? So what happens is that if you, for instance, if you're in a very, so basically the higher the film speed, the less light you need. The slower the shutter speed, the less light you need. And the wider the aperture, the more light that's coming through. And so basically you just have to kind of figure out, if you're trying to get an image, you need a certain amount of exposure, right? And so you can either, so if it's a dark room, you can either lower the shutter speed, increase the film speed, or widen the aperture. And all of them have different benefits, right, and problems. So one of the things, the simplest one is shutter speed, right? So if the shutter speed is slow, let's say it's 1 second, if anything in your frame moves during that 1 second, you'll get blur, right? So typically 1/60th of a second is like, most people can hold it, but with a zoom lens where you're magnifying stuff, it becomes harder to hold still because things are sort of bigger, right? And so on a normal 35mm camera, sort of one rule of thumb is you have the length of the camera. So this is like a 50mm lens, and the longer the length of the camera, so the longer your lens, the more magnified it is. And so I guess this might be a little bit technical, but basically it's 1 over the lens length is a good rule of thumb. So if it's like a 60mm lens, 1/60th you could reliably hold with your hands. If it's a wide-angle lens, like a 35mm lens, then 1/30th you might be able to hold. But if it's he's got like a 200mm lens, you're going to want like 1/250th. Okay, but that you should sort of play with because it also depends on your skill. And then one of the things you need to be careful of is a lot of times we call it mashing the trigger. But when you take a picture, you go, and then it blurs, right? And holding it still is really important, so that's a separate discussion. The other thing about aperture, which is interesting, is if you look at, here's a lens, and here's your film, right? And you have you have some object here. What's happening is when you're focusing, that's not how it works. When you're focusing, it focuses on some dot on the film, right? And things in front of or behind where your focus is set become sort of slightly blurry, right? The thing that's interesting is that the narrower your aperture is, the narrower the light is, and the less blur there is, right? So this is actually like you'll figure it out intuitively eventually. But basically, what happens is that the tighter the aperture, the more is in focus. So if you have like a person and a car and then a building, right? At like f 16, all of these will be in focus, right? But like at f1, this eye will be in focus, but the far eye won't. So your focal plane, when your lens is wide open, your focal plane is about this thick. So if I took a picture of you with my f1 lens, if I put your glasses in focus, your ears and your nose won't be in focus, right? Whereas if I narrow it all down, I can get everything. And on most lenses, what you see is, if you look here, it says 16, 11, 8, 4, 1. Those are apertures. And this is what it means is if you focus on something, and let's say you put it to f16 aperture, it means that if you're focused here, everything else within this range will also be in focus. And as you stop it down, or open up the lens and make it brighter, it becomes blurrier and blurrier around the edges, which means that the amount of this which is in focus becomes narrower and narrower. And why this is important, which is interesting, is so normally when you're just shooting snapshots and stuff like that, you're probably trying to get as much in focus as possible. So typically what you end up doing as a calculation when you're trying to shoot a photo is, if I want to take a picture of you, I figure out the slowest I can hold the camera shutter speed. So let's say that's 1/60th, right? Then I say, okay, and what is the aperture at which everything I need is in focus? So that may be like f, I don't know, 5.6 or whatever. Is that 5.6? Or like, 5.6 or whatever. Then what you do is when you meter it, it will say, well, then you're going to have to shoot at ISO 400 in this light. And the thing is, the higher the ISO, the grainier the images, which is similar to being blurry in that you don't have as much information. And so that's kind of the balance, right? And I don't know. Okay, so is there any first of all, is there any basic question with this part? So one more photo term is we call them stops, like one f-stop. But basically what happens is if you have...
Are those just interval numbers?
Well, so they're slightly different in how you measure them, but these all click at one stop each. So if you go like 1/60th of a second at say f2 and let's say ISO 100. Okay, if that's the picture you're taking, if you go and you double this, so like you go 1/25th or 1/20th or whatever, and then that means you got to get twice more light in there, right? So then if you go f 1.4, which is one f-stop open, and ISO 100, this works, right? So you're shooting faster, but you're opening wider, which makes your focal narrower, right? But let's say you don't want to do that. You want to keep the f at f2, but you want to go to 125. You could go 1/125, f 1.4, and you could change your ISO to 200 and just double that. So f-stops don't go up the same way that your shutter speed and your ISO go up. They go up as like I don't know. It goes 1/1.4, 2, 2.8, 4. So they go up. If you look on your aperture ring, you'll see that they go up in sort of weird numbers. And I'm trying to remember what it is. Do you think it's a
I don't know if it's exponential or if
it's logarithmic or something like that. But so it's not a straight linear thing. But these are basically linear. It's like double, 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 double. So if you double the ISO, you can basically double your shutter speed, or increase your f-stop by 1 or decrease it by 1. And then where some of the art comes into it is, for instance, if you're taking a picture of something that you want blurred, like a car or a river, then you keep the shutter speed low on purpose, right? Or if you want to take a picture of somebody but you want to blur the background, then you open up your lens on purpose. Um, does that make sense? And did you know this all, by the way? You knew most of this. And one of the interesting things you can do with these lenses is there's in your focus there's infinity, right? And so if you're shooting, infinity is anything further than whatever, right? But what's interesting is if you have let's say you're shooting at f16 and you're shooting something at infinity and you want to get stuff in the foreground, since you don't need anything beyond infinity, you focus to infinity and then you move it to your aperture. And it basically doubles your depth of field. You see what I'm saying? So let's say you have, let's say this is your depth of field, right? And this is infinity, right? Infinity plus x is still infinity, right? So you focus on infinity and then you slide it over so that infinity is here, which is the maximum of your depth of field, so you get 2x more. Do you see what I'm saying?
So what? I don't understand the interaction between depth. I don't know what depth of field does.
Oh, sorry. Depth of field is how far away it is from you, right? And depth of field is how far away
And how much of the picture
and how much is in focus, right?
A photographer in the 40s who was part of the WPA project, and he actually got his first Leica in a card game, and he was living with Edward Weston at the time, and he's like, all right, great, I have a camera now. Okay, how do I use it? What are all these settings I have to use? And the guy was running out the door because, I don't know, he had no money and had to sneak out. And he said, on the dark side of the street, shoot f4. On the bright side, shoot at f8. And that's all. That's all the instruction he ever had in photography. And his pictures are great. So, like, you know, it's a lot simpler than you know, if you're using automatic, great. You know, aperture priority or something, you know, the camera will do all the work for you.
I think though that one thing that's interesting though is I think when you're doing snapshots at the beginning and all you're focused on is trying to get things in focus, film like the shutter speed seems to feel like the most important thing because usually the way you ruin is because it moves.
Yeah.
But as you start getting into trying to make your photos look a certain way, aperture becomes way more important because then you get the blurring and the depth of field and stuff like that. And actually if you have a tripod, it doesn't matter how fast you push the shutter anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that one of the really intense things is that when you're used to shooting a little, you know, simple bakachon camera, you're really limited by the shutter speed. But like most of the photos that I shoot on my Hasselblad, I mean, it's open for more than a second, you know, the shutter. And it's just, you would never do that with a handheld camera. So then suddenly you're shooting at ISO 50 at like f16. Then you just have to worry. And like the Wikipedians, I was reading a thread about how they take pictures of bugs. They stick them in the freezer. So then like bugs are frozen so they can get a depth of field. Because when you shoot bugs with macro, like when it's really close, your depth of field becomes really, really small. So they shoot at like f32 or something.
Yeah,
where
I
it's-
didn't understand that. You
Yeah.
said that. You said that last.
Frozen bugs.
You were talking about this on your stream, and like I never shot macro before, and like you shot the
frog.
The frog,
Yeah.
right? And you were talking about like.
Did you freeze
No,
it?
no.
Yeah, but my image is always like if you want to shoot, you know, if you want the monster bouquet and you
Yeah.
shoot it f1 or whatever,
Right.
and you get the like that picture of that frog, it's just actually like one spot on his back that's in focus.
Yeah, and that's at
But
like
that's
f11 or 16
Right.
or something.
So how does that work?
Well, when you've got, so there's two things. When you do the macro, first of all, your depth of focus gets narrow, and then when you put a lens extender on, which
when
is
you use macro, your depth of focus gets narrow.
yeah. So the closer things are, basically, the thinner the depth of field is, and as you get
How
further.
does that work? Does
That's
anybody
it.
know how that works?
Well,
I'm sorry,
yeah, I can describe it with like graphs.
But basically it's the fact that the distance is r squared, so it goes up as a curve like this. So as the closer you get, the distances become exaggerated. So it's kind of like they're magnified, you know. And so when you're shooting a frog, you really have to get to like f32 to get both eyes in focus, which is crazy. And so there are people actually that Photoshop that take a bug and they focus here, 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 and slice it with different focuses, and then they Photoshop it together to make the whole bug in focus. And then there's actually new sensor technology where they're layering these sensors so that you can shoot at one time like a whole bunch of different focuses. and then they pull it together. So it's like shooting 20 shots together, and so you get like the whole bug in focus, which is, so the sensor stuff is going to change photography a lot, because one is that you can do things like put the focus in the sensor, and the other thing is that the sensors are getting faster without getting lower quality. And so before, everybody was kind of on the same playing field where ISO 100 was ISO 100, and all you could deal with was aperture, shutter speed, and now with the, like, you get ISO 3200 that looks like ISO 50, and then suddenly you can change everything. Yeah.
Motion ID's got that new 1DS mark.
Oh, you got a new one?
So you shoot pictures on his at 3200,
And it's-
look at my picture shot at 100, and his have got less noise.
Really? Yeah, that's yeah.
So wait, they're gonna layer sensors?
Yeah, so basically what they're going to do is you get a sensor like this, right? Sensor is in focus. These sensors are focused at slightly different levels, right? And then what you do is so basically you're basically increasing your depth of field. By it's like taking a bunch of pictures at different focuses and then attaching them together. And the other thing is basically they can make really stupid cameras where you don't focus, and the layer that's most in focus just survives, and they've got demos of this, but it's gonna.
Who's making them?
Some startup company. One of my friends is an investor. It's slightly stealthy, but I think there's some information about it. But and so it's going to be interesting how the Luddites react. Because the thing is that eventually these will also start to get more dense and higher quality, and like.
Well, I think there's a huge resurgence in like black and white film and crafty old cameras and Holgas and Lomos and everything, because they don't want it to be perfect. They want it to have character, depth, or something. That's not really why I got into it, but I can see that there's a lot of people doing that. It's a sort of rebellion. It's like photography makes different kinds of painting possible.
Right.
The snapshot cameras are partially responsible for like cubist art, and modern art, and once they freed themselves from having to represent things perfectly, they said, okay, the painters could go and do whatever they wanted then, because they didn't have to do portraits, because you could just take a picture.
That's very true.
With digital, you can have a perfect picture, and then film, which used to be all journalists use film up until like 5 years ago. Now, none of them do. They might carry it for their personal projects, but those that still love it. But it's gives a lot more freedom to everybody, I think.
Digital or film?
Both.
Ah.
You
Digital
can leave
free
a
up
perfection
film.
one place and you can get the imperfection somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of it is about doing stuff. I mean, like, is looking at good stuff is also the important part, because I think the problem is that then why I think the internet's important is whether it's Flickr or blogs or whatever. If you start seeing people shooting good photos, then you sort of increase your aspirations, right? And good photos mean artistic and stuff like that, right? And I think that one of the interesting trends that we're seeing is that because the equipment's getting cheaper to like do processing in your computer instead of a dark room, or mess with things like your aperture, I think that you don't have to have as much of an investment. So I think that what's interesting is that the sales of like books about photography and like tutorials about photography are increasing, and like even just like my friends, their photos are all getting, I think, better. Generally speaking.
You go to like and like you just like see one of those photos on Flickr on like one of the first 4 pages, on one of the first pages, the first little 4 pictures, and like you think you've navigated the rivers of Flickr pretty well, and not everybody, but you've got like all these different contacts and you've seen everybody, and like, but like you'll find a photo and you'll find one photo that'll spark your eye, and you'll go to that guy's photo, and you open his photo stream and he's got like 80 pictures, and he's just either got on or he doesn't really take it very seriously, and like you go through every one and he's like shooting with like pretty standard f40 or whatever, and it's just like, mind-blowing good, and it's like there's no comments on any of the photos, and you're like, damn,
There was some,
how did
you
this
know,
guy not get discovered? He's so good, you know?
15 years ago, if you were into photography, you'd be lucky if there's a photo club in your neighborhood, in your town, or somewhere you could go and actually like do this. You know, that's where you got all your input about your photography.
Yeah.
You know? Otherwise, you have a little pile of prints that you do in your dark room late at night, and nobody ever sees them until you die. And then
Right?
you become famous.
But now it's like, yeah, it's
But
like
now-
I don't have time to keep up with all the like
2 days ago, I was looking at Flickr, and
We
you know
could
this.
kill you.
find
I'm
all my
working on that
unexposed
myself.
negatives.
2 days ago, I was, you know, Flickr has the 4 random ones at the bottom, most recent ones. And I see something interesting. I thought at first somebody's posting old pictures from, you know, maybe 1910 or something. This kind of misty things done with, I don't know what kind of camera she's using. It was a girl in the Ukraine, and she's shooting film. She just joined Flickr, and she uploaded about 60 pictures, and they're all done on a crappy old film camera in this apartment that kind of looks like, you ever see Fight Club? You know, Fight Club, that really disaster house. That's where she's living. And she's doing pictures of, like, I don't know, her grandmother taking a bath, and like, you know, so it looks, I mean, this stuff is amazing. And nobody's seen it. I think I was the first one to view every one of them. And I favorited every photo she did. Every single one, because they were fantastic. And
Wow.
there's no way anyone would ever see that 15 years ago.
If you adjust so that you can actually see the clouds in the sky, the cat will be completely black. But if you shoot the cat, what will happen is the clouds will be all white, because you don't have enough dynamic range on the film. And so what the dodging and burning sometimes does is your film can actually capture the cat in the sky, but your display or your JPEG can't actually output that much range. Your monitor can't do that. And so so the raw mode that we're talking about on the cameras a lot of times,
Yeah.
you can actually capture more range than you can print. And so what happens is that you can either do dodging and burning, or there's a bunch of different other tricks you can do to try to get the cat in, but also keep the clouds in, and not wash them out. Like in the morning, or during the, like when the sun is out, it's slightly bluish, and as you get into the evening, the light turns orangish, right? And then this is a tungsten light bulb, so it's kind of orange, and then outdoors is daylight. And so in the old days, you had 2 kinds of film, basically. You had tungsten film and daylight film. And if you shot, and why that is that the light color is different. But since our eyes are really adaptable, even if the light is orange, if everything is orange, then we see white as white. But if you look at, for instance, if you try to look at the outside and have the inside of the room together, you'll notice that the outside of the room is blue and the inside of the room is orange. But when you're outside, everything looks white, and if you're inside, everything looks white, and your eye is just adjusting. And so the reason you have 2 kinds of film is, with tungsten film, things in tungsten light, white looks white. And in daylight film, things in the daylight, white looks white. If you shoot it the reverse, if I use daylight film in here, everything will look orange. And if I use tungsten film outside, everything looks blue. And so typically what happens is, like, so this is an example of somebody that I shot inside using daylight film. This is what most people's indoor photos look like, because most of the photo film that you buy is daylight film. And so when you shoot inside, everything looks orange, right? So if you take this, and this is the color temperature here. If you move this over, you can see how he's getting bluer. So the picture now suddenly doesn't look like a crappy snapshot, right? And then this is called blacks. And what this means is there's a thing called a response curve, which is this curve here, right? And what this means is that this is, so if it's linear, straight like this, it means that it's very even. So if in the sensor you have a certain exposure, you're getting a certain color of black. But what you're doing when you're adjusting contrast or doing all these things that you used to do in the film is you're changing this curve so that, like, everything below here, if you want to make it black, because you see how there's nothing in this picture is black. So it looks kind of like washed out, right? But if you bump up the blacks like this, you see how suddenly his beard and stuff like that looks a little bit sharper. And then if you increase the contrast like that, and then you see how the color comes out. And then what you can do is you can, this gets a slightly fancier, but like his lips and stuff are too red, right? That's because those are saturated colors. You can take just the saturation down. Oops, where is it? Like that, and then his lips are okay, right? And so suddenly you've gone from this photo that used to look like it was taken from a bakachon camera, and now it looks like it's like sharper, and it's really easy to do. And you used to just spend half an hour getting this right in the darkroom, and you can do this in software.
When you're taking like artistic, like that process is like, I think a good technique for like correcting a picture. But like this idea, getting back to the idea about just post-processing in general, like when you're taking like any kind of photos, like not necessarily like this kind of photo, but maybe if you see a photo like that you kind of you say like, oh, this is like, it catches your eye and you want to take this photo, and sometimes it's the contrast isn't exactly the way that you want it, or sometimes maybe if you, do you ever like blurry, like if you like, you can take this kind of photo that's called like defocused photo, where you like, if you go to Shinjuku and it's like all these beautiful lights, if you defocus your camera, you'll get these like kind of artistic bulbish things, and if you kind of like cross your eyes a little bit, you can see it, you know what I mean? And and I walk around a little bit, and like sometimes if I, Jim always says like when you look at your negatives, sometimes, or you look at your prints, just turn them upside down. Look at all your pictures upside down. Like which ones look interesting upside down, just based on balance and where stuff is in black and white. Like what looks good. If it's just all white, geometry. What looks good. And if you kind of blur your eyes, like either in the nighttime and looking at those bokeh beautiful lights, or even in the daytime you're looking at contrast and shapes and colors and stuff, you can kind of, maybe you'll see something that catches your eye, but it's not the perfect contrast, or it's kind of flat, or it's kind of just something. But if you think about it with post-processing in mind, like I'm going to take this picture now, and it's not exactly the picture that I want now, but I know what I'm going to do with it in post-processing. And if you develop that skill more and more and more, you can like really start to develop a personality even in your photos. Like if you look at somebody like Sean, one of our friends, if you go to Motion ID's Flickr stream, all of his photos look quite the same. If you go to anybody's photo stream who's really developed their style, like they just are honing that technique. They're like, oh, I know what I'm gonna do with this photo. Maybe they don't exactly compose with it in mind, but as soon as they take it, they look at it and they say, oh yeah, I'm gonna bring these blacks out. Or
This habit about like where you're standing, how close you want to get to your subject, like where you put yourself, it shows in your pictures.
Yeah, but like composing with post-processing in mind, whether it's the darkroom or it's the lightroom,
Sure.
It's a great way to like just open the whole world up further.
And I think that, Jim told me this too, and I agree, it's like, once you learn how to get it all right, then it's about getting one thing wrong to make it unique. You know what I mean? Like this one, you're not supposed to have crap in the foreground, right? But if you do it on purpose, then some people will think it looks like crap, but some people say, oh, those glasses in the foreground look kind of neat, and so, or like you're saying, like something out of focus or something blurred, or the horizon being off. Those are all really cool. They can make a normal shot look cool, but usually it has to be like one thing that's wrong, not three things that are wrong. I think that's the hard part. Is
there any? This is okay. Is there any work on taking someone's pictures? You can analyze. You can do, like you said, the color response curve. There's some of these that you can calculate. Is there any work on sort of clone this person's style onto my photo?
Yeah, you can copy and paste all the settings from one.
Right.
Well, I mean, Well,
but even here.
I mean automatically. So like you have
Well,
Yeah.
well, so there's so the
You only have
most of
the
these have some basic
So
things
they'll
like
just apply.
if you grab a picture.
It's the effect, not the setting. That
Well, here
true, though.
I'm trying to find.
They've got it.
I actually feel my liver get bigger when I set this to Jimokuni.
So they're like presets. So you can
Yeah.
you can see like here.
Well, so these are
these are
effects.
all different kinds
These
of
are-
settings.
If you think of it like functions and return values, and these are the functions you apply.
Yeah. And then basically this is just a box with a mirror on it. So
So you can see,
yeah. So
and
basically you
it
can
goes
see
to the
this.
sensors.
Okay. So you can see the mirror in there,
Okay.
and then if you go, you can see the sensor.
Oh, cool.
And then this just winds the mirror back down. And then this part, you can just remove that. You can just pop that out. And it's all modular. And then when you fire, it's
Wow.
going like that.
Yeah. Sure. Shall I film you on the camera?
And then there's dust on here. So the other thing about doing this is this thing called an Arctic butterfly. What you do is it blows the dust off of it, and it creates static electricity, which you can use to. It's actually a smudge. Sucks. Sucks. Is that gonna come off? The biggest difficulty of all this stuff is dealing with dust.
Yeah.
And you can mount this sideways too.
What's the difference between that sideways?
Oh, this is not square. Oops. And then what happens is that the shutter is actually in here, in the lens. And this moves, but there's the shutter here is the one that actually decides. Decides how fast it goes.
Mm-hmm.
And so
So you have to use the cable.
So yeah, so this triggers, it tells you when the shutter has gone, and this tells the back when the shutter is fired. So this, I can set the ISO to like 400, and then white balance to tungsten, and then say 162. 30th. And then you just focus.
Sweet.
And then it's just in there.
Okay.
So the camera is here. This is the
This is,
mirror, and this is the
yeah, lens, mirror,
mirror and camera.
sensor. So there's no electricity in front of here. So the other thing. So original, the old Hasselblad packs where you just have film.
So this is maybe they've been doing this.
This is like 50
since a
years
long
old.
time.
Yeah.
Oh.
And
And they,
yeah, so when there's film, there's nothing here. The other kind of interesting thing. Well, this one isn't. The other one that I have two Hasselblads, but the other one is electronic, and what it does is well, actually, it's not that relevant. But one of the things is with the film, depending on how long, if you like overexpose it or underexpose it, and then you adjust it in the development, it changes the contrast. And so there's another Hasselblad electronic one, and what that has is it has a sensor inside, and what you do is you point it at different shades of gray in your scene, like this is like a 7 or this is like a 1, and you set it, and then it'll tell you what the contrast is that you're shooting, and then you adjust that in your film cartridge, and it will adjust the contrast in the film.
Perfect.
So today we do this in the computer,
Right.
but this is actually Ansel Adams' technique. You could do the
Analog
contrast
photos.
in the film.